Welcome to the Big Idea podcast, where we focus on food. Today we're going to be talking to Sudhir, the founder of Algrow Biosciences. We certainly touch on the science side of things today, but probably more of the conversation is about the entrepreneurial journey from startup through to pivot and change direction and some of the challenges and thought processes in that. So if you're interested in starting and growing a company, today is probably a great conversation for you, as well as the technology behind some of the things he's doing and his team is doing.
Welcome to the Big Idea
with
podcast, where we focus on
let's
food.
Get into the conversation.
People tell me you're the founder CEO of Algrow Biosciences. This will be our first time talking to you today on the podcast. How are you? What are you up to?
Yeah, thank you for having me here, Andrew. We at Algrow Biosciences, what we do is we're trying to utilize microalgae to create bionutrients.
Right.
This is where we are after 6-7 months of journey, picking up our pre-seed money from BIV, and now currently part of the ProVeg incubator, traveling with ProVeg. Mainly our goal with establishing Algrow Biosciences has been to kind of get to this bioingredients which are less explored, wherein we are having a full valorization approach of all the ingredients that are coming from biomass. When we look at the state of the art for this particular algae that we're working with, it's primarily being utilized for getting pigments, but we've gone a step ahead and taken some inspiration from pea and soy cultivation out there to kind of valorize the entire biomass for different value compounds, which includes your macronutrients like your carbohydrate, lipid, and protein, but also pigments which have food and nutraceutical value. So a little bit of my journey and my background. I have a food science background, basically sensory and food chemistry, to be specific. Worked for a while in the US, actually, before starting on this journey, right? I was in the R&D function, primarily in the US, within the flavoring companies as well as with nutraceutical companies as product developer. And voila, took the leap of faith and moved to Singapore to start off Algrow Biosciences, mainly from a pain point, like a personal pain point of working as an application solution specialist for some of the industry leaders within the US. And I guess the solutions that we were delivering from a flavoring standpoint were kind of lacking something, was one of the drivers to kind of start off Algrow Biosciences. So, and when I started off Algrow Biosciences, it's basically I was envisioning to revolutionize the B2C dairy segment, utilizing the existing biomasses from other companies to create the products in the dairy sector, right? And few months into the journey, we did realize that the unit economics don't work, at least from the type of way algae is being dealt with, the ingredient that comes. And if you put in dairy products, so the pricing is out of question for consumer to kind of bite on it. So, and that's when few months into the journey, we made a pivot to this whole idea of going after this underexplored ingredients within the algae. Well, algae, what we are using primarily still is rich in protein. It has about 60 to 70% of the biomass is still protein. Mm-hmm. And that's still the goal, is to kind of get to these compounds like protein and lipids, while also getting the other pigments which have value in the market out there. So yeah, basically that's how we've kind of evolved from a B2C to a B2B company. And it also made sense that the reach would be bigger it's because The ingredients that are coming from the biorefinery approach that we currently are embarking upon our R&D is more wider. So it also extends beyond the food industry, but still our focus is still mainly on the food and alternative protein sector because the focus is still like protein and lipid.
Sudhir?
That's a very long-winded answer.
That was incredible. Normally, I would be sort of asking you about the company, what you do, and then we would go into lots of kind of Q&A. But you've taken me through so much now. I've got to sort of figure out, and my brain is not great at this time of the morning. I've got to figure out which of the 110 questions I have in my head I should ask first. So. Let's go back to the beginning, if that's okay, because some people are not as up to speed on things as you are, given that you've been living this for many months / years. Microalgae.
Yeah.
Take us through. So that's your primary source of micronutrient, etc. Take us through what is microalgae? Why is it great? Where are you getting it from? Are you growing it yourself? Is somebody else growing it? Let's start with the microalgae side of things.
Right. So technically what we're using is cyanobacteria, which still falls in like microalgae.
Okay.
Which looks blue-green in nature. Something which is food-friendly, grass-approved, generally recognized as safe to approve and like use in food preparations. So currently what we are doing is the upstream, which is the cultivation of this microalgae. Mm-hmm. We are actually getting it from like a partner, the upstream part, like the partner.
Yeah.
And our focus has been mainly on the midstream and the downstream processing to get to all these bioingredients.
So you're taking the initial microalgae from a partner, from a source, and then you're sort of figuring out how to break it into its component parts in many different ways.
Yes, that's correct, Andrew. Yeah. And while doing that, we are having a proprietary way of doing so that it's food compliant. Mm-hmm. Because the current state of the art exists for a biorefinery approach around this organism. But it's not food friendly for all the components because of how the process exists. Here we are having a process which is unique to kind of maintain the cell integrity while we extract these components so that your downstream costs are also like pretty decent. And the purity of the components that we get is higher compared to the state of the art as it exists.
Got it. So let's give, do you have any examples of how, and you mentioned it was generally recognized as safe as a food ingredient. Do you have any examples for people of how microalgae today is traditionally used in the food industry so that people can think, okay, excuse me, this is what it does. This is how we use it today. Have you got some examples that sort of people will recognize?
Absolutely. I mean, for this particular organism itself, right, like in our case, which is spirulina that we are using.
Okay.
It is being utilized both in the food and nutraceutical. It's consumed as spirulina food in many of the cases where the entire biomass is consumed before it is broken down into different pieces. The other way people are utilizing it is for its pigments post extraction from the biomass. And the pigments again are used as like food colorants. They're used in the nutraceutical industry. So that's where there's a long history of use in food products. Of course, it's also used in the feed industry, but in the food and nutraceutical products, it's recognized to be safe because of its long history of use.
And in spirulina, if I'm correct, is being used as a sort of a high nutrient density addition to whether it's supplements or some people put it in sort of juice drinks and sort of health drinks and that sort of thing because they think it gives them nutrient benefits. Is that correct?
That is right, Andrew. I mean, it's utilized 100% directly to consume, where it's actually dealing with, you're absolutely right with the nutrition angle. When in case, I mean, I'm speaking from India for whomsoever is hearing here. Malnutrition is a big problem in India for the
Yep.
foods that are there. And spirulina biomass supplementing for the foods is not uncommon, mainly for this high dense nutrition that it produces. So having said that, it's also used in your beverages and all like smoothies, where it's used probably like partially, maybe not completely, but it is used as a supplement mainly from a nutrition angle as it exists now.
Got it. And then the next thing you were discussing was that something like 60% of the microalgae is protein, but then it's made up of other things as well. And what you're doing is figuring out how to break it into its different parts to see if those parts are useful, valuable in other use, for other uses. Is that a good summary?
That's partially right, Andrew. I mean, there is already a market for these other components as well.
Okay.
Some components are like one of the pigment, the blue pigment that comes from spirulina is an established thing, mainly as food in the food and the nutraceutical industry.
Yep.
Of course, protein and the lipids being rich in omega-3s do have a value proposition in the food sector largely, and more so within the alternative protein and alternate lipid space. There's also like polysaccharides, which are shown. I mean, this is still an emerging side of things, the polysaccharide fraction from spirulina. Its use is something in the cosmetic and in the medical industry. So that's like a work in progress. I mean, the basic fundamental research showcases that there is this anti-cancerous activity and whatnot, which makes it like viable in the cosmetic and in the medical industry.
Got it. And the next thing I sort of picked out was you originally started the business with a view to leveraging it for a sort of alt dairy space, but the cost of production and the cost of the ultimate ingredient that you guys would create didn't work in the economics of the end product of that alt dairy product. I wonder two things. One is that potentially a factor of size/volume? So in other words, if you actually used your process at a large enough scale, whether the cost would be achievable and beneficial to the alt dairy that you originally kind of set out to solve. That's kind of question one. And question two is, how do you know, now that you've pivoted towards sort of other components of the spirulina, that those components will have the right economics as either a B2B ingredient or however you decide to use those components, whether it's cosmetics, food, or another category?
That's a great question, Andrew. So going back to the first part of the question, right? Like, is it a scale volume kind of a thing?
Yeah.
It potentially can work at scale and volume, but we were also looking at like how the technology is kind of progressing for the algal biomass that we were utilizing.
Right.
What we were using as the ingredient was actually coming from a form of cultivation, right? So basically, which is heterotrophic cultivation, which is lack of sunlight, kind of a biomass that was used to create the dairy products, was initially the plan. Now, we had a few issues. I mean, scale and volume is still something to be determined kind of a thing with time. It may or may not work. But also besides that, there was an inherent issue of organoleptic and the shelf stability, at least with the type of biomass that we were utilizing.
Okay.
Which was another key factor which was driving this decision, right? Like, okay, we need to kind of go back to the first principles thinking, because right, like algal biomass rich in nutrition and all, but these underlying problems need to be solved first. And that was actually the pivot, right? Like, where we have identified like there are certain compounds and there's certain pigments which give that, from a food standpoint, like the organoleptics do not match with like the consumer's expectations.
So they don't deliver what you need them to for the consumer.
Sorry, one more time.
So they don't deliver what you need them to for the consumer, the end consumer.
Correct. Yes, that's right. So mainly the scale is one thing, but it's also on this organoleptics, which is the taste and appearance. So with this approach with biorefinery, and like I was mentioning at the beginning of the podcast, we are having through the process, the idea is to maintain high integrity of the fractions, which means that there is no contamination of pigments with these macros and all, which leads to a better fraction, and hence it also brings in like better sensorial properties when utilized in food.
When you let's make sure we don't go over that without understanding. Better fraction, just so other people who are listening, probably me too, if I'm honest, know what you mean by that.
Right. So when we are doing a biorefinery as it exists, Andrew, like we do have the green pigment, which is the chlorophyll.
Yep.
That is present within spirulina. It is shown from our sensory trials that some of the off notes do arise from that. Beyond, there is other components as well, which kind of lead to that.
Off notes of taste or smell or both?
Off notes of taste primarily, and some part of the smell, but that's not necessarily chlorophyll. That's coming from something else, but it's mainly the notes of taste.
So and it's giving it maybe a fishy taste or a sort of...
Yeah, you can say like sea-like grassy notes is what it kind of alludes to.
Okay.
Yeah, and when we are saying integrity, meaning that it is in its own state and it's not kind of adhering, or rather, I would say contaminating the other components, which in our case, the prime importance is with the proteins and the lipids. So that's what is the difference that we are looking versus like when it's produced with different cultivation or different methods of downstream processing in the photosynthetic realm itself. That is one of the things as an underlying problem when you're actually doing it for food. Because when you look at it, people are utilizing the fraction like when they're doing with a different kind of cell lysis method for the feed industry. And you do see that the biomass fractions are all like green in color in that case. So here we are saying like, okay, through the process, we're going to get like these components which are not as much tarnished with like chlorophyll. So you get like better output when you're actually creating products and all.
Okay, so you were originally set out to use microalgae so that you could get what were you attempting in the first instance? And obviously you changed your direction, so we don't need to spend too much time on this, but what were you hoping originally to get out of it, subject to the costs working and those off notes not being there? What were you trying to end up with, and what were you trying to do with it?
Right. So the initial intent with getting this heterotropically cultivated biomass was to provide better nutrition in the dairy, because that was one of the key things. Besides also thinking that because we are doing heterotropic cultivation where there's no instance of chlorophyll, it gives like better sensorial characteristics. But what we have observed, actually, there is some inherent issues when the heterotropic biomass, at least the ones which we worked upon, they have started to show some chlorophyll-like activity, even post-spray drying, which was where I was talking about the shelf life, right? Like, so the instance of how to kind of store is kind of a tricky thing when it comes to working with those biomasses. So it was obvious that, right, like the idea was the heterotropic biomass is going to give, okay, a neutral taste and color in the sense of the word, but it was not matching that expectations. And that was proven through our sensory trial.
So it wasn't neutral. It wasn't a neutral color, and it wasn't a neutral flavor.
That is right. Yeah, that's what we started to see with that.
I'm aware are using. I wonder whether that product, whether that will have the same sort of fishy, seaweedy notes, whether it, obviously as it's yellow/gold, probably won't have the same the same green characteristics as regular spirulina, etc. That might be interesting to look at if you haven't already.
So we have looked at both white kind of biomass and as well as gold.
Okay.
The gold biomass, the yellow one, is relatively better. But again, in both the biomasses, it was evident that the pricing, the cost barrier is like too high to create products. Yeah.
Got it. So you pivoted, you changed, you changed direction. Take us through, two things. As an entrepreneur who sets out with a particular objective and a team and everything working on one direction, realizing you have to change, how challenging was that? What was the thought process there?
Yeah, that's the loaded question for sure. Yeah, it's always like difficult to kind of break it to the team, right? Like, and one thing I keep saying this to the team as well, right? Like, I feel like with technology and the R&D and all, with time you will get to a solution, but like running a team in a startup at least as an entrepreneur, that's the more challenging part, I feel like, as a first time entrepreneur. But I think the conversation internally we had at the time was mainly around these two things, like I mentioned, right? It goes back to the basics in our industry, which is the price and taste, color, texture, smell, these things, right? And the more compelling case was utilizing this novel technology where it maintains this component integrity. And also, we have an approach of cross subsidizing its fractions, which makes it more attractive from a price standpoint. Mm-hmm. And the good thing at least from the literature, which we would be testing in a few food applications pretty soon here, is the functionality of the protein through the process that we are having is shown to have like egg replacement kind of properties.
Okay.
So that's something to be tested within a month's time. Yep.
Sorry, so egg replacement properties, you mean in terms of functionality, i.e. binding and that sort of thing, or taste?
Yeah, that is right. It's more like physicochemical kind of properties.
Got it.
Which is forming, gelling, aeration kind of properties. It's shown to that. There's a few papers kind of suggesting that as well. In some instances, as good as your egg white protein. So that's something which we are actually even planning on showcasing in a few competitions that we are in through food applications. And it's also like gonna show the strength of the process to get to these ingredients, because that's one other thing which is like a problem to solve in the industry. Because while there's a lot of precision fermentation companies out there tackling the dairy proteins and all, you do see not much, at least from my standpoint. I may be wrong, maybe some are in stealth, but on the egg replacement side, it's still, I would say there hasn't been that big of a breakthrough yet with the proteins part and the functionality that they bring.
Do you think the egg replacement product could have any capabilities in terms of replacing methicellulose, or is that too high a hurdle to overcome?
We intend, or rather from technical literature, we think that is possible to replace methylcellulose. But even if that's not the case, and we are in talks with like some baking companies already, right? Like once we get this protein out, which is, like I said, mentioned within this month's time, do some prototypes in the baking space. That's like our first agenda, to kind of see how it is performing. Yeah, it is a difficult problem, and that's a problem which even during my past life as an employee with the flavor company, one of the projects that I was working was actually replacing methyl cellulose. And it's not an easy thing, but we hope. I mean, miracles do happen, but yet science wins at the end of the day.
So how did the team respond when you told them, hey guys, we're going to have to change a direction and do something slightly different?
Right. So in order to align, it did take like a few weeks, right? Like to kind of clear first thing in my mind, to have a clarity of thought, and also to kind of articulate that to them and why we are doing and all. Of course, the team initially was like, what about what we have done so far? But then after we had like conversation around these fine points, right? Like why we are doing, why we are heading in this direction, what's the benefit, and what is the value, especially that we are going to add when we are actually embarking upon this kind of a route, was more evident. And one other thing was, for a period of few months, we were actually working with an advisor from Arizona State who had some know-how about this process and all as well. So that kind of gave us more conviction, right? Like when the actual pivot happened, it did give like more conviction to kind of pursue as well. And it was not that difficult to kind of convince the entire team to kind of move in the direction, because there was already some exposure from the team to, this particular technology and what it can actually bring.
Got it. So let's talk about where you're going now. It took you some weeks to sort of decide and then align the team that there's a new sense of direction. How did you figure that out? How did you figure out where you were going next? Was it based on what you were seeing from your results and trying to understand where, as you say, the value in that was? How did you decide now was the time to change direction and this is the direction we're going in?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. I think it's a culmination of a lot of things. One is also through the journey as an entrepreneur, despite having a science and food science specific background, the learning of different things from a technical standpoint, to get that kind of conviction that, okay, this, you do see that when you're actually reviewing a lot of technical papers and all, right? Like through your journey as a deep tech startup, you do see the gaps, and that there's a weird patterns that you actually see as an entrepreneur. Like, why has the research come to this point and then it's stopped, right? And then asking the question as to, like, did they stop because it's not solvable, or is it like the funding exhausted, whatnot, right? So it's that. And like I was mentioning, it was also like a journey that we had with our advisor, and the know-how about the process, and some work being already done on this kind of a biorefinery approach. So it's all these things together. And of course, right, like there is part of it also is gut feel, to kind of see along with the data. There is also gut feel for element for sure, because there's still some uncertainties in within certain points in this process. But I think thanks to my co-founder Suki, who's looking on the business side of things, right? Like, to keep it real, to see like what are the first things that we need to address when we are doing this biorefinery, so that we get a product out fast, because there's a few fractions going on and things like that.
So what do you hope to get out of the current approach? What sort of elements or nutrients or outputs are you sort of chasing after in terms of the new technology?
Right. So we have divided into two phases once to get to the full valorization of the biomass. The first stage is mainly, so we like predominantly it has two fractions, I should say. One fraction which is a pigment protein kind of fraction, and the other fraction also contains protein, but it is along with the lipids and carbohydrates. So the fraction that we are addressing right now, and designing experiments and running, doing R&Ds on this first part, which is the protein pigment part. So that would be the first thing that would be addressed. And then we kind of move and work on the second fraction, which is, you can say it's a soluble and insoluble fraction to be broad, right?
Got it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to change direction and ask you a two-part question, and it's entirely up to you whether you answer one part or both. Entirely up to you. So the first part of the question is, what have you really enjoyed? What have you loved about the entrepreneurial experience? And the second part of the question is, what has been the toughest, most challenging aspects of the entrepreneurial experience? And you're, if you want to take just the positive, you can do that. If you want to take just the negative, you can do that. Or if you want to bundle them together and talk about both, entirely up to you.
No, let's do both. I mean, there's the highs are highs and the lows are lows, and that's what makes it like the journey really special, I feel like. I would say, I mean, let's start off with the positives rather than the negatives. Let's go for the positives. As a first-time entrepreneur and having worked in the corporate world, both in India and in US, and starting off this journey, yes, I had to let go a lot of like come out of comfort zone and do, right? But the good thing is, I think the sense of ownership and the sense of building, which every day you wake up to that fact, right? Like you're building something. I mean, even if it's helping one other person, right? Like the impact part definitely is the big driver, and the positive and the ownership, right? Like you can do a lot of things which maybe in the corporate world we didn't never had the chance to do so, right? Like you had your managers, you had your directors, you had to convince them, but you could not do. But here, yes, you still are accountable. I'm not saying you're not accountable. If anything, you're more accountable to a lot of people, right? Which includes, of course, like public investors, your team, and everything. But it's still like when you're driving the business, it gives you a sense of joy, I feel like. As chaotic as it could be, it does give you that sense of ownership. And it's very hard to describe. See, I'm out of words, Andrew, right? Like you do get that fulfillment.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's a lot of ways to make money. I mean, there's much easier ways than entrepreneurship. I mean, but entrepreneurship is not that, it's mainly problem solving and making people's lives better. And that actually is the biggest thing. And really in the sense of the world, because I feel like you have much more control over the processes and all. Coming, that's that. And coming to the negatives, I would say, I think like I was mentioning, one of the things which is not negative per se, there's nothing I would say is negative. It's all a process, but certain parts of it are like difficult, or rather from a personal lens. And the two things that come to my mind is definitely operations, like how do you operate? I know R&D and marketing and all these things get a lot of limelight, right? Like, oh wow, but to get all these things done, right? Like, and currently as we speak, our research scientist is working in Singapore on this project, right? He's sitting in Singapore, I'm in India, so there's two parallel paths of R&D going on. So the logistics and this kind of the ops is definitely the difficult part, which I mean, it's a learning in progress, right? But that is, although it does not get that much clout, it's one of the harder things. And I think building a team as well, right? Like, because you are resource constrained at the beginning, um, and then still you need to navigate, right? Like, and still you need to get like the best people on the team, and that whole hiring and convincing people to kind of believe in your dream, and that's not easy, right? Like, if unless you had like $100 million sitting in the bank, then yeah, okay, all the good talent will come and work for you, but of course they're going to work for some other startup in the all protein space, or maybe in the industry where they paid high bucks. So yeah, it's to bring people on who have the same calling, and the mission orientation is definitely a challenge, right? Like So I would say that is the thing. I mean, it's not negative, but as I do more, I speak more, as I travel in the journey more, that's something, I hope with time I get better at these things as well.
I remember the first day of receiving a wire transfer, my first wire transfer, or check, or however it arrived, for my first startup from investors, and that day turned it from a business plan or a pitch deck or whatever we were going through to raise money to a real business. It felt on that day like, oh wow, somebody just put $250,000 or whatever the amount was into my business bank account. I guess I better go do this thing for real and not just talk about it. And I felt a weight of responsibility, because it was like, oh, okay, somebody's actually trusted me with quite a lot of money. So I don't want to fail. I can't fail. And I felt that weight. It was like a physical weight on my shoulders of responsibility. And then interestingly, the next day when I sort of kicked everything off, and I'd already sort of been running things, but when I really kicked everything off the next day, I was suddenly aware that although that $250,000 seemed like a lot of money to an individual, because there was just me at the beginning, I was aware every time I spent something on, spent money, the number in my bank account was going down, and it was like oxygen, watching oxygen flowing out of a balloon. And as soon as I got to zero, I was dead. So somehow I had to figure out how to go make that 250 increase instead of decrease. And it's very clarifying, because when you're in a corporate environment, maybe 40%, if you're lucky, maybe 60% is probably more likely of your time is justifying your existence to the next person or people in the line. Like, I should be here. I should have a job. I should have a salary. Let me prove to you, not the consumer, not the shareholder, but let me prove to you why I should have this desk and this laptop and this salary. So my value in a corporate environment was probably, let's say, 50% of my effort in terms of focusing on the business, and 50% of my effort proving to somebody else that I was worth, paying. When I went into the entrepreneurial environment, it was suddenly okay, I've got 15 things to do today. Only 5 of them are going to get me closer to more money. 10 of them are not. Which of the 15 things should I be doing? And obviously, suddenly it brings an incredible clarity to how you spend your day and what you're focused on. So no, I totally get what you're saying. Unfortunately, we've pretty much come to the end, and I'd like to ask you 2 quick questions. One is, how can people who are listening help Algrow Biosciences? What sort of assistance, help are you looking for? And if someone's listening, how can they get involved in doing what you're doing, or in some way, whether it's, I don't know, as an employee or an investor or whatever it might be?
Right. Yeah. I think one of the big things that we've been looking for in this order is still, we've had mentors in the past, and for different reasons they had parted ways with the company. So mainly from an R&D standpoint, we have a business mentor now. That's one thing that we are looking for. Someone who believes in algae, and someone who has gone through this whole exercise of dealing with it in upstream, midstream, and downstream. That's where, someone who can add value. That would be one, right? Like mentorship for sure. The second thing, in this climate, I mean, of course, everyone, although we haven't officially opened a fundraising round, it still would be good to start off the conversations and kind of see. So That's one other thing, or even advise on that sense, right? Like how do we actually kind of go about there? Is that would be a good thing. The third thing is we're still looking for a full-time CTO. I know not many people want to move to India, but weirdly enough, I did get a few contacts even from US. They're open to kind of working in India. So on the personal front, that's one other thing that we also been like looking into. So as to get like more structure to the team, because now my role, although it says CEO, I'm also involved very closely with R&D activities, um, which is, I mean, of course, it's not a bad thing, but I feel like the CTO has been an item for us which has been longstanding, and to kind of get someone who believes in what we are doing would be like of much help.
Now, you mentioned India. You're also in Singapore. So are you needing someone in Singapore, or are you needing someone in India, or both?
Yeah, so the business function is in Singapore.
Okay.
The R&D is set up, R&D and the ops are in India. So, but it's mainly all the focus and all the money that we picked in the pre-seed is mainly going into R&D, right? Like, of course, this is mainly we are in an R&D phase. So, yeah, this person would be deployed in India. So Singapore is still, I would say, like the business team to kind of grow. There's still time for that.
Got it. Perfect. And what's the best way of people reaching out to you, Sudhir?
Yes. So please reach out to me on like Sudhir Kumar Pasupuleti LinkedIn. That's the place where I'm mostly available. The other thing is email. Email sudhir9389@algrow.co. There's a hyphen between al and grow, so algrow.co.
Okay. And I'm looking at your LinkedIn right now, and it's Sudhir, Sudhir Kumar, Kumar, and then last name Pasupuleti, which is PAS as in sugar, UPULETI. I'm sure if you type in, well, it works for me because you and I are connected to sort of 400 of the same people. So it might not work for somebody who's not connected to, your network. So Sudhir Kumar, Kumar Pasupuleti. And the web address is Algrow Biosciences.co. And you gave your email already. So yes. Amazing. So Sudhir, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming to the Big Idea podcast where we focus on food. I really could have spent another hour or more talking to you. It was really enjoyable. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. Pleasure's all mine. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. And do reach out to Sudhir if you think you can help or want to get involved in what they're doing. Cool stuff.
Yep. We're here. Okay.
Thanks again for coming along to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Sudhir from Algrow Biosciences. This is Andrew from Big Idea Ventures. We're focused on working with the world's best entrepreneurs, scientists and engineers to solve the world's greatest challenges. So that's the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. By all means, leave comments or reach out to Sudhir or myself through the normal means, bigideaventures.com or through his website. And by all means, reach out to Sudhir and myself via LinkedIn if you're interested in what we're doing and want to help in any way. All right. Thanks very much. Look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye.